Please be seated. His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." In 1643, the Parliament of England appointed a committee to, quote, detect and demolish any idolatrous monuments in Canterbury Cathedral. When the committee came to Canterbury, one of its members, the Reverend Richard Culmer, described the cathedral as nothing but a stable of idols. So for 3 days, Culmer and his fellow committee members destroyed statues. They pulled down the tapestries and the paintings. They defaced the screens and altars, and they shattered many of the medieval stained glass windows. One of the windows depicted the Trinity, and it was high up, far out of reach. Culmer had a Canterbury town ladder brought inside, and he climbed 60 steps all the way to the very top. And as the horrified crowd looked on, he smashed the stained glass window to pieces with a long pike. "It is a shame for a minister to be seen up there," an angry member of the crowd yelled to him as the broken glass rained down. And from the top of the ladder, Culmer replied, "Sir, I counted no shame but an honor. My master whipped the living buyers and sellers out of the temple. These are dead idols which defile the worship of God." It is hard to read our gospel lesson today and not think about the dangers of zealous anger. In Leviticus, the law commanded new mothers to sacrifice a lamb in the temple for their ritual purification after giving birth. And if they could not afford a lamb, the law provided a substitute. You could get a turtle dove or a pigeon. And that's what Jesus' parents did at the temple after he was born. Mary and Joseph could not afford a lamb to sacrifice, so they bought a pair of birds. And they would have bought them from the very merchants, or the kind of merchants that Jesus now drives out of the temple. It's quite a shocking scene. It's as if someone in a fit of rage attacked a church and destroyed the very baptismal font where they had been baptized as a baby. Isn't it dangerous to let zeal consume us? It was not just idols that Richard Culmer and other Puritans like him destroyed in their campaign. There were many objects that were not in the least theologically objectionable that were also destroyed. The mobs of rampaging clerics and soldiers and government officials and even the local townspeople, they did not always stop to parse out these fine theological distinctions. They became inflamed by the violence. The sheer mania for destruction created its own momentum and led to more destruction. Their zeal consumed them. In Jesus' day, the Zealots were a Jewish sect violently opposed to the Roman occupation of Palestine. Some of the Zealots carried short daggers, which they used to stab any Romans or Jews thought to be collaborators with the Roman Empire. And so even though the Zealots were supposed to be a liberating force for Jews, some of them, in pursuit of this goal, would murder their fellow Jews. Their zeal had curdled into something more sinister. Righteousness had become a kind of fanatical self-righteousness which justified violence. Their zeal consumed them. And of course, the same happens today. Everywhere we turn, there is war, and not just war on the battlefields of Ukraine or Gaza. There is our ever-present culture war, where we fight over everything, even things that used to be relatively non-controversial, like libraries, or the efficacy of vaccines, or the value of a college education, or professional sports. There can be no quarter given to the other side in our quest to reform and purify our corrupt culture. Our zeal has consumed us. But I think it was different with Jesus. I don't think Jesus' actions in the temple as it was happening made any sense to the disciples. John's gospel is very clear about that. John is very clear that it's only when the disciples remembered this incident through the lens of the cross, through the whole scope of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and ascension, that they really understood. Zeal for his Father's house had consumed Jesus, but it was in a very different way than the zeal that had consumed the Puritans or the Zealots or the culture warriors today. For Jesus, his zeal tore him apart on the cross. That is the literal Greek meaning of that verb, consume, in our passage. To tear him apart. Jesus used his zeal to put himself in harm's way. He made himself the object, not the subject, of violence. And in this way, his zeal did not become self-righteousness. His zeal became self-sacrifice. And it is this self-sacrifice that sanctifies Jesus' action in the temple. That is the difference between what he did and what Richard Colmer did at Canterbury Cathedral. Near the end of his life, after the political winds had shifted, Colmer was arrested and made to answer for his actions at Canterbury. And the authorities asked him, they said, "Why did you destroy all the images of Jesus Christ in the cathedral, in the stained glass windows, but none of the devil?" And Colmer replied he was just following orders. Parliament had told him to take down Christ, but had said nothing of the devil. And his answer is a warning to all of us. For all of us who would like to follow the example of Jesus at the temple and purify everything that we consider corrupt, let us take care that we do not end up like Richard Colmer, thinking we are serving Jesus, but only serving ourselves, or maybe something worse. To truly follow Jesus' example in the temple, we must be willing to put our zeal for righteousness in the service of a self-sacrifice that costs us something, even our own lives. To let ourselves be torn apart on the cross. That's how our zeal is sanctified. And if that sounds impossible, or if you, like me, aren't quite sure you can make that kind of sacrifice of being torn apart on the cross, then I have some good news. We are in good company. The disciples couldn't do it either. So maybe instead of trying to emulate Jesus and his self-sacrificial, all-consuming zeal, instead, we can be grateful for it. Grateful that Jesus had so much zeal for his Father's house that it covers for my own imperfect, and I will admit often flagging, zeal. Maybe the same is true for you. Grateful that the burden of purifying our corrupt culture doesn't have to fall on our shoulders. grateful that Jesus cleansed the temple so that we don't have to.